and welcome to Jenna Van Mourik's YouTube channel. If you have been around here before, or have looked at any of the thumbnails on this channel, you may be thinking to yourself, she does not look like the person who's usually here. And you would be correct. I am not Jenna Van Mourik. My name is Audrey Bodine. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, why do I care? Who are you? Why are you here? All good questions. My name is Audrey, and I am a writer and a reader, but for the purposes of this video, the most important thing for you to know is that I am a friend of Jenna Van Mourik's. And I don't know why I keep saying her name in full, it's just kind of a thing. I am here today to interview Jenna for her self-published Saturday YouTube series. Now, Jenna is one of the most creative and imaginative people that I know, and she has done a lot of interesting things on her YouTube channel. But one thing she wasn't sure she should do was interview herself for this segment of her channel. So she asked me to fill in as guest host, and I couldn't be happier to be here. So today I will be interviewing Jenna on her debut novel, Jerusalem's Daughter, for her segment of Self-Published Saturdays. This moment is a bit surreal for me, as I'm sure it is for many people who have known Jenna for a while. Or, you know, Jenna herself, which maybe she will attest to later on, I don't know. But you see, I remember a day on a February morn or afternoon, possibly evening, 3 years ago, when I stumbled onto an Instagram account that told me two things about the person who ran it. One, they knew how to take some very beautiful pictures, and two, they really love the color green. And if you know Jenna, you know that that is as true today as it was then, if not more so. Since then, I have watched her learn and grow and become more confident in her abilities as a storyteller. And along with our fellow friend and encourager, Alicia of For the Love of Christian Fiction, we have seen all of the stages of this book come together in our group chat. It has been a wild ride. We couldn't be more excited for you, Jen. And I am very excited to be here to interview you today to talk about your book, Jerusalem's Daughter. It is easily one of my favorite books, for its rich history, memorable characters, but most of all, for the story of faith that you have woven in that gives me a new perspective on the last week of Jesus' life. So, here to tell us all about this beautiful book is Jenna Van Mourik. If you would, please introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much to Audrey for guest hosting this interview. This has been really fun, and yes, it is very surreal. If you're new here or you just want like a little bit of a reintroduction, my name is Jenna Van Mourik. I'm an inspired writer and an inspirational fiction reader who reads, writes, and lives for Jesus. Most people, I think, tend to know me as the biblical fiction blogger on Instagram, which is not my username, but it accidentally, on purpose, became my brand. Aside from posting bookstagram pictures of my favorite biblical fiction, surrounding my home with biblical fiction, blogging about biblical fiction, and making YouTube videos about biblical fiction, I also write biblical fiction, and my debut novel, Jerusalem's Daughter, is coming out 3/16/21, or may possibly already be available for purchase by the time this video goes up. So if it is, be sure to check the links down in the description box below for all of that information. I'm also gonna pop all of my social media links and handles up here on the screen in case you want to check those out or follow along or do any of those kinds of things. But yes, that is a little bit about me, or at least the internet me. Personal me lives in Northern California with my husband and my amazing dog, Piper, who normally loves to get in my face when I'm filming, but for some reason has decided to go sit in another room, and I can't get her to come out. I've always been obsessed with history and learning and just digging into ancient time periods especially, so it seems sort of only natural that at some point I was going to end up writing biblical fiction, even if I didn't know it or ever expect that at the time.
Now, there was a time when you said, I will never write biblical fiction. So, what changed? What has inspired you to write biblical fiction?
This is such a good question and also a little bit embarrassing. I'm gonna go ahead and roll the footage that you are specifically referring to right here because I can.
But the thing about biblical fiction is that usually it's meticulously researched because there is a huge amount of respect that goes to the source material, which is obviously the Bible, and of course a desire to make sure that your book honors God when you're writing it and that the readers feel like the original Bible is being honored when they're reading it. As a writer, I can imagine that that would be an extremely daunting undertaking. I have a huge amount of respect for them, and that genre is way more than I could ever handle writing.
Growing up, my favorite movies were things like The Prince of Egypt and Ben-Hur. In my spare time, I was obsessed with watching like Drive Through History and other documentaries about like ancient history, specifically like Egypt, Israel, the Middle East, that whole kind of area. I was always super fascinated by that. So I think in hindsight, when I look back, it's like, well, of course I would end up writing biblical fiction at some point in my life. But there was a long period of time, you know, from like age 0 to 18, 19, however old I was when I started writing this book, that I didn't think I was going to write at all. I was always a very creative kid. I did a lot of, I used to put on plays for my family with my cousins. In high school, I got really into videography work and I did a little bit of freelance videography for companies and weddings and special events and just in general editing videos. I loved editing videos. And when I originally enrolled in college, I enrolled as a film student, which I ended up changing later down in the line because I just wasn't really feeling like that was where I was meant to be at the time. But it still gave me a really good foundation for storytelling and also for creating an author platform or an author presence. Again, when I did all of these things, I had very different visions for how my life or how I thought my life was going to turn out, and it ended up being like nothing I'd expected it to be. But looking back, I can see how clearly each of the things I did or was interested in, even though I wasn't doing them for that reason, they were setting me up for where I am today, which is a pretty cool God thing because, you know, I didn't ever anticipate that and it just happened that way, which is pretty crazy. But I guess I should probably mention how I discovered biblical fiction. And originally I discovered biblical fiction shortly after my grandma Shirley passed away, which was a very difficult time for almost everyone in my family because she was like truly the foundation of the family. It just all worked because of her. But my grandma was a huge influence on me, and I got most of my like love of history from her, my love of study from her, I think. She's the one who introduced me to Drive Through History documentaries and just very much encouraged my obsession with ancient history and Bible study and set a great example for me. So there's that. But when she passed away, that was a really, really difficult time for me. And I had no idea that biblical fiction was a genre. In fact, for the most part, I was pretty cynical about Christian fiction as a whole. And I think that there are many people who might relate to this. When you're on the outside looking in at Christian fiction, it might seem a little bit irrelevant or not. I took many classes in literary theory and criticism. I could go on a whole tangent about this, but my point is that there's a certain, or there can be a certain stigma surrounding Christian fiction when you're on the outside looking in and being like, what's the big deal with Christian fiction? Isn't it all kind of the same? Does it really ever actually speak to anything? Or is it all just kind of irrelevant or not touching in a certain way? I later found out that that was very much not true, but keep in mind I was 15, 16 in that age range, 15, 16, 17 at the time, so that was kind of my teenage perspective on what Christian fiction was. But I remember specifically after my grandma passed away being just really heavily depressed, and I had always loved reading and consuming stories in any form, whether that was theater, musicals, books, movies, film student. And I remember going to Barnes & Noble with my cousin at the time, and at the time I was really into the general YA market. And, you know, I'd found that in the months after my grandma's passing, those books in that market that I'd always thought was like my genre weren't speaking to me. I wasn't enjoying reading them. They brought me no fulfillment. And I just was like, I don't know why I'm reading this anymore. And again, I was just going through kind of a depressed state because I was really like grieving my grandma, and my whole family was. But we ended up wandering over into the Christian fiction section, and I was perusing in the aisle, not really expecting anything to catch my eye, and then I saw a wonderful novel by Misu Andrews, The Pharaoh's Daughter, and it completely now changed the course of my entire life. This book was, I can't even put it into words, but essentially this book was on the top shelf, which at my Barnes & Noble, they put like on the top shelf the new releases or like top picks for that genre, and this book was on the top shelf in the Christian fiction section. And I remember looking at it and thinking, this looks unlike any Christian fiction I've ever seen or read or heard before, because I think I was used to seeing the leading genre in Christian fiction, which is like the prairie historical 1800s like romance kind of Christian fiction, and this one really stood out because there is this is not a prairie dress that she is wearing, that the character is wearing. And it also stood out to me for another reason, because Exodus, Moses, the Prince of Egypt, all of that had always been my favorite Bible story, and just a passage of the Bible that I felt very personally close to and personally intertwined with, just like my story and the way I think. So I saw this book and instantly I was like, there's no question about it, I have to get it, just because it had Egypt on the cover, and I was, again, obsessed with Egyptian history, and I was like, well, this book, I have to get it, I have to read it. Never heard of Misu Andrews, didn't know what biblical fiction was. This was the only biblical fiction book in the store at the time, because I remember looking and being like, is this a new thing that I've just never heard of before? And I remember reading it in like a few hours and just tearing through it like voraciously, and a whole new world was unlocked, and I ended up buying so much more biblical fiction, obviously, and just reading it and gobbling it up as fast as I could, jumping from like one author to the next. I devoured Misu Andrews, and then Connie Lynn Cassette, and Jelanian Smith, and Angela Hunt, and it just continued to snowball from there. And I just really connected with these books, and they spoke to everything that I enjoyed, which was studying, Bible study, history, all of that. And shortly after that, or a couple years after that, I should say, I started my Instagram, my Bookstagram, and YouTube, just wanting a place to talk about these books and talk about all things biblical fiction. And I said in that video that I really wanted to be a writer, because at this point I had changed my major from film to English, because I realized that that was more the avenue of storytelling and creativity that I wanted to pursue, as opposed to being a film student. And I remember specifically saying, but the one thing I would never, ever, 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 ever try to write is biblical fiction, because it intimidated me. And the reason that it intimidated me is because, as such a voracious reader of biblical fiction, I knew that those of us who like biblical fiction have very high standards for what we consume in the biblical fiction genre. And I remember thinking to myself, I would never do that, because I would be too scared that I wouldn't meet those expectations, or that it would just be too hard to do all of that research and coming up with all of those different things and plotting and storytelling and blah 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 blah. And within the same month of recording that video, I started writing Jerusalem's Daughter, which is just, again, a total God thing, because I would not have done that on my own. But never say never, because that's usually what God is anticipating. Going back to the Exodus, just to quote a little bit of the Bible and my own testimony, for me personally, I really just felt suddenly very called to tell this story. The characters popped into my head during Easter, because it was at Easter time that I recorded that video and got my inspiration for the novel. The characters popped into my head and they wouldn't leave me alone, so I had to write it. But I remember very specifically thinking, like, I don't want to do this. I don't think that I don't know if this is a good idea. I don't know if this is a good plan. And to me, that just reminded me, and I remember thinking of Moses and the Exodus, and when God told Moses through the burning bush, to go and do what he said, to go back to Egypt and speak to the Pharaoh and intercede on the Hebrews' behalf. I remember when Moses was saying, like, no, not me, send someone else. And a passage that has kind of been in my head for my whole life, but specifically makes some make some appearances at specific moments as well. A passage popped into my head that was, "Who made man's mouth? Who made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Did not I? Now go, I will help you speak and teach you what to say." I apologize if I'm misquoting that, but that's in general the verse, and I'll pop it up right here for you so that you can get the exact quotation word for word. But I remember thinking that and just realizing, like, well, now I have to go. God says, you know, I did all of this. I made people. I made everything. I'm in total control. And I'm telling you to go. Now go. So I went. And I went with it. And I wrote a biblical fiction novel. And looking back again, as I look back at all of my different steps that I took from my childhood to now, I see how clearly it was orchestrated, but I would never have expected that I would have ended up here if I'd been told that at the time. But yeah, we ended up here.
Writing biblical fiction can be a daunting task because you have the weight of historical accuracy as a responsibility. When writing scenes depicting biblical characters, how did this affect your process?
This is a really good question also, and I talk about this a lot in the author's note at the end of the book, where I talk about some of the more specific choices that I made. Something that was definitely difficult was just trying to achieve a certain sense of synergy. The Gospels they disagree with each other, which is actually a good thing because it shows that not everyone remembers everything in the same way. But you have the Synoptic Gospels, and then you have John, and there's the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that all, for the most part, agree with each other. There are little differences here and there, little things, but then you have John, and they all have different views on things, and how they all tell the story of Jesus in a different way. And it's fascinating to study. I highly recommend that you study your Bible. But that was definitely something that was difficult, was just trying to come up with a timeline that had a certain sense of synergy, and trying to take all of those gospel accounts and roll them into one to plot the events of my story in with the events of the Bible. Something that was definitely very helpful was this book here that I'm going to pop up on the screen because it's in my office and I can't get up to get it very easily, but the CSB Christ Chronological, which is a version of the Gospels that organizes each of them in columns side by side so that you can easily compare what happens where, and it organizes them chronologically. And there's notes throughout that explain like why certain things were placed where they were placed within the CSB, and that was super helpful because it just kind of helped me to see in a certain perspective of like, okay, how would all of these things have happened? So paying attention to the timeline and doing a lot of research, writing down dates, using the CSB Christ Chronological, using a chronological study Bible to try and figure that out helped me a lot, because I could have the structure of the Gospels and then I could just weave in my characters and see where those paths intersect, because my book takes place from the perspective of fictional characters. So my book isn't about a main biblical character, but rather fictional characters who interact with or witness events in the Bible. So that's similar to Connie Lynn Cassette's writing style, if you've read any of her books. For a really quick and easy example, this is the comparison that I always use. Misu Andrews wrote this amazing book called Miriam, but it is of course about Miriam from the Bible, from the Exodus. Connie Lynn Cassette wrote Counted with the Stars, which is an Exodus retelling from the perspective of just a regular Egyptian girl. So she's not a named character in the Bible. It's much more like traditional historical fiction, I think, as we would define it. Historical fiction being just fiction that takes place during a specific time in history, versus this reimagines the life of a specific historical figure. My book would fall more in this category, where it is a fictional character experiencing a specific time in history. Let's talk about portraying biblical figures though. For the most part, I just tried to put myself in the character's shoes and imagine what they were seeing and just record what the characters saw and what they would have experienced based on what we know is said and done in the Bible. I enjoyed fleshing out certain figures more than others and imagining what their personalities would have been like or how they might have interacted with my characters. Specifically talking about the portrayal of Jesus Christ in my book, though, is a really interesting subject, because I remember thinking as I wrote this that I didn't want to focus a lot on the traditional things we focus on as authors. So like physical appearance, mannerisms, things that would normally bring a character to life, because Jesus isn't a character in my opinion. He is a real person and he is the Son of God. So I went into that with a lot of reverence, and for the most part I took all of his dialogue or adapted it from different things he said throughout scripture that is recorded. So even if, you know, he didn't say that thing at that exact time, most of his dialogue is inspired by or taken directly from scripture. Because one, I didn't want to be painting a picture and focusing a lot on what Jesus looked like, since we have no way of knowing that, and two, I didn't want to be putting words in his mouth. So I went straight to the Bible for that and focused more on how the characters felt when they were around Jesus than necessarily what they were seeing. And I think that summarizes up a lot of it, where I just focused more on what the characters were feeling and less on what they were seeing or physically experiencing throughout the story. I was heavily influenced by the 1959 version of Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston. An interesting point about the 1959 Charlton Heston Ben-Hur film is that although Jesus is a important character in the story, they never actually show his face on the screen. As a film buff and a movie buff, I really find this an interesting take. Instead of hearing the voice of Jesus or seeing his face, instead we see light shining on the characters, or the voices in the background fading and music swelling instead. And I've always really liked this because it leaves it up to you, kind of. It just denotes a certain amount of reverence and respect and leaves it up to you as the audience to kind of infer what is going on. So that was something where I was heavily influenced by those choices and those decisions, and tried to do something similar in my book, where rather than focusing a lot on what the characters were seeing and describing historical figures whom we have no way of really knowing what they looked like or sounded like, I tried to focus more on writing about how the characters felt when they were in the presence of those historical figures. And for dialogue, I specifically just went to the scripture. For Jesus's dialogue, almost all of it comes from scripture or is adapted from different things that he's said throughout scripture. A very small portion of it is from my own imagination. For the most part, it's all either directly quoted or adapted from something he said at some point, or that we know he said at some point during the gospel accounts. So I hope that that answers some of that question.
Who was the first character you imagined in this story, and how have they changed from your early drafts?
The first character to appear in my head was definitely Shamira, and after that, Asa. I don't know if Shamira has changed as much as my perspective about Shamira has changed. Shamira, for me to write her, she was a bit of an enigma. She was a bundle of contradictions, and she was very difficult, which is very in line with her character. But it took many, many drafts to pin her down and get her right. And I don't think that her character has changed as much as my understanding of her character. So her general attitude and personality and all of those traits and those kinds of things have stayed the same, but I've just discovered more about her and have been able to write her more accurately. Asa, on the other hand, is definitely a character who came into my head at the same time as Shamira, but I had no clue who he was. I just had, just a visual image and a few personality traits, but nothing else to go on. A few lines of dialogue that I knew he would say at some point in the story and that he does say, but nothing else much beyond that. I would say that the reason that Asa changed the most in terms of my characterization of him is because in the beginning, I didn't know who Asa was, I didn't know who his family was, and in the final draft, as you would know from reading the blurb, Asa is a Levite who is studying under his father to become a priest. And it turns out that that perspective actually becomes quite pivotal in the book. And I can't really say too much more without spoiling, but in general, you'll have to learn more about them in the story. But originally, Asa came from a very different background than he does in the final draft. And that is all I'm going to say about that.
What character has changed the most from your initial perception of them?
The characters that have changed the most are definitely Root and Levy, and for many different reasons. But for one, initially I thought Root was much more of a standoffish character who would be more of an adversary to Shamira, and in the final draft they end up becoming best friends and allies, and their relationship is one of my favorite relationships of all, because it turns out that Root isn't standoffish like I had originally thought, but she's willing to speak her mind, especially when it concerns those she loves. And she's exceptionally loving, but she is firm when she wants to be or firm when she has to be, and she'll tell it like it is. She'll call you out if she thinks that you're messing up or doing something that's wrong. And originally, I think I'd interpreted her as much more prim, proper, standoffish, disapproving, but in the final draft it turned out that I ended up discovering that she isn't so disapproving as much as she is just wanting the best for everyone, and does so in a very loving way. So she changed a lot. And then another character who changed quite a bit is Levy, and I can't quite say why, for reasons that may be considered spoilery, but I was really excited to delve deeper into her character and expand more upon her role for the sequel.
Tell us about your main characters.
As I may or may not have already said, there are two main characters in this book, Asa and Shamira. Asa and Shamira have known each other for a very long time, and to explain this, I'm gonna read the back cover. That may be a bit of a cheater, but oh well. Having grown up in the impoverished lower city of Jerusalem, Shamira is no stranger to injustice at the hands of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Her family is shunned by many in the Jewish community who believe that their misfortune in life is the result of a secret sin. Rumors are spreading of a nearby healer with incredible abilities, and if the stories are true, then the Messiah may be near. Shamira will stop at nothing in the pursuit of a miracle. Asa spends every day at the temple under the tutelage of his strict father, an elite Levite priest who enforces the laws without mercy. Between the growing demands of the Roman government and the threats of the zealots, tensions are high. When Shamira, the girl who stole his heart years ago, asks him to help her find the healer called Jesus, he must choose to either follow in his father's footsteps or forge his own path. Shamira knows that both her life and the lives of her loved ones could be changed forever, but only if she can find a way to speak to the man called Jesus of Nazareth before it's too late. If I had to sum up each of these characters in just a few words, or what I love about these characters, I would say that I love Shamira's passion, her strength, and her faith, and specifically her fierce loyalty to whatever she loves. If she loves it, if she's close to you, if she cares about you, she loves you 1,000%. And she will do whatever it takes to ensure that you are safe or cared for, or that you know that you are loved. And what I love about Asa is just his quiet strength and his willingness to support Shamira and help her in any way he can. And I also love his love for knowledge and his love for studying and learning, because his love for studying and learning, like he does every day in the temple, is really going to be something that motivates him to study and learn more about who is this Jesus of Nazareth figure that everyone is talking about. And that's something that propels him on his journey. So I would say that Shamira is very passionate and protective and fiercely loyal, and that's what propels her to find the Messiah. And Asa, on the other hand, is very inquisitive and wants to study and learn, and just has a love of knowledge and a love of Shamira. And that's what propels him to join her in the journey to find a Messiah. And I can't say much more from there without giving you any spoilers, but that's the gist of it.
Your cast as a whole struggles with some very true-to-life obstacles. Was it a conscious decision to include these, or did they present themselves as a part of the character while you were getting to know them?
This is kind of a tricky question for me, because I don't think that I would say that I intentionally included many real life struggles in my story. I think that I just wanted to write characters who were based on life. And I have certainly lived my share of life, and I've known people who've walked through all different kinds of things. And when I look at that, that's life. And I strive to write a story that is realistic and shows people living their lives, but I don't know if that was so much a conscious decision as much as it just was, this is life, this is what people go through, this is what the characters go through. Certainly, many of these things were personal to me. Every writer draws some from their own personal experience, but I don't think it was a conscious decision of mine to write a character and then be like, oh, what do they struggle with? What's going to be there? I don't think that that was so much of a conscious decision as much as it just was me writing what I know, which is life and how God carries us through life. I think that that's something that has always appealed to me about biblical fiction, is that when I look at biblical fiction specifically, of course this can happen in many, many different books, but specifically in biblical fiction, one of the things that appeals to me most is that you see these figures, maybe biblical figures or maybe figures living in biblical times, enduring real life struggles, and it brings the Bible to life, you know? And suddenly their struggles aren't just words that we see on a page, but they're relatable to us, and we can understand people in biblical times on an even deeper level by imagining what their lives were like through the art of story or through parables. And I've always just found something very intriguing in the idea that if people can live through all these different things and, you know, come out stronger in their faith for it in Bible times, then there is no reason why we can't do that today in modern times. And there's just something about that idea that has always been very comforting to me, and something that's always been a bit of an inspiration. So maybe that's where that comes from to a certain extent, but it wasn't an effort on my part. It was more just a desire to write based on life and show life.
Throughout your story, Shamira's family is faced with choices of trusting God in different circumstances and for various reasons. What has this book taught you about God in your own spiritual walk?
On a very meta level, more than anything, writing this book has just taught me about following in God's leading, which is quite literal, because I had to follow his leading with the inspiration of this story, and, you know, with the just whole process of writing it. So, you know, on a meta, more external level, this book taught me to just trust that God had a plan and continue to write. But in terms of maybe the story and what I myself have learned and taken away from the story, something that's been emphasized to me throughout this story is just the power of prayer and the power of words and telling our own stories. Not in as much of like I'm an author telling a story, a fictional story, but sharing our testimonies and what can happen when we are willing to be bold and fearless and go in the direction that God is calling us to tell our story and tell a testimony, because you never know who needs to hear those words or who needs to hear that story, and what can happen when you are just willing to be vulnerable and let God speak through you and see what he does through your words. So that is probably the bigger things that I've learned from writing this story, both from the process of writing it and just that I've learned from the story itself.
Did you have a moment in the book writing process when it all became real to you? When it hit you that yes, you really did write a book?
There are so many little moments. Probably the first time I typed the end at the end of NaNoWriMo 2018. The first time I ever saw my book printed out, when I printed it out to edit it in 2019. When I sent it to Audrey in 2020. When I signed a contract and booked an editor was such a huge step. When I revealed my cover and my title on social media officially, and even now, just like getting my proof copies, and it still doesn't feel real, but I would say all of those little landmarks are just things that like continually are like, whoa, this is happening. I'm writing a book.
Is there any chapter in particular that you think captures the theme of your book? If so, why?
I don't know if I can say why without giving away spoilers, but I'm just gonna throw some numbers out there that I think are really important numbers that if you're reading the book, you might want to pay attention to, because these are some chapters that hold a very special place in my heart. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, Chapter 9, Chapter 11, and the epilogue. Enjoy that. Do with that information what you will. Those chapters include some of my favorite quotes from the book and just some of my favorite moments that, in my opinion, summarize like what the theme of the book is, which is essentially just me restating the question, but without giving away any spoilers, that's what I can give you.
Why did you choose to publish your book independently instead of pursuing traditional publishing? Are you happy with that decision?
Ah, the age-old question. This is going to be a long answer too, and I apologize because this video is probably exceptionally long already, but hopefully you guys are okay with that. I chose to self-publish for a variety of reasons, but mainly I started this interview with an author series, this self-published Saturday, traditionally published Tuesday series on YouTube, as a way for me to pick authors' brains, because I knew at a certain point, like, okay, I've written the story and now I need to decide, am I going to traditionally publish or am I going to self-publish? Because that was going to determine what my next steps were in whether or not I went for betas and an editor, or if I started trying to query and look up getting an agent and submitting to publishing houses. I was at the fork in the road basically, where I needed to kind of decide what to do. I started this interview with an author series and as a way to ask questions that I'd always wanted to ask, and ironically I feel like I ended up getting my answers before I'd even published the first video in this series, and I'll link the whole playlist down below. But before I'd even published the first one, I just kind of already knew what the answer was going to be, and I'd always said, you know, like, people would ask me on social media, are you self-publishing, are you traditionally publishing, when's the book coming out? And I would just say, you know, I'm praying about it, waiting on God to tell me what I'm supposed to do next, because that's kind of how the whole process had been going. And before I'd even published them, I was putting them together, but before I'd even published it, I just got like, I had a sense of direction already. And I chose self-publishing for a lot of reasons, but to summarize, I wanted control over the content, not just, you know, like the explicit content or the sexual content or all that kind of stuff, but control over the biblical content and the scriptural content. I wanted to have full say over, you know, what went into the book in terms of making sure it was scripturally and biblically accurate as much as it can be for historical fiction, biblical fiction. I wanted control over the content. I had become so attached to that point, I'd become so attached to the story at that point also, that I was already brainstorming cover designs and all those kinds of ideas. So I wanted control over that. And I already had like a vision in my head. And I think that, you know, I could have pursued traditional publishing, and there's nothing wrong with pursuing traditional publishing, but at a certain point I realized, you know, how much I had learned from blogging and interviewing authors and just making friends in this community. I felt like I had the skill set that I needed to self-publish, and any skills that I didn't have, I knew people I could hire who would be willing to help me out with those things, or that I could outsource those different things to. And I just started to feel not a sense of urgency in that I rushed to get the book out, because again, from that point to when the book is actually coming out was over a year of continuing on that process and trying to make sure that I did everything right or to the best of my ability. But I had just started to feel like a sense of urgency was placed on my heart of like, there's a person that this story needs to reach, and it needs to reach them, even if it's just one person, it needs to reach them, you know, sooner rather than later. And that sense and that just like clear direction, doors opened in places that I didn't expect them to open, and I just took all of these things as, you know, God telling me and directing me again to self-publish and pursue a career as a self-published biblical fiction author, which is again never in a million years where I thought I was going to be. But I'm here now and I'm really happy about it, and I wouldn't change a thing. Again, looking back at my life, it's already so perfect. Not that I had a perfect life, but it's just the story of my life is so perfectly written that I can so clearly see God's hand at every turning point and step in my life. And there's something about that that just really is very powerful and makes me feel a lot of feelings. I wouldn't change a thing because God is the ultimate author and he already got everything right.
What has been the highlight of the post-writing process?
The highlight of the post-writing process. I don't know. Am I there yet? I'm still having to proofread and go through proof copies while this video is being filmed, so it doesn't feel like it's ever gonna end. I keep saying like, oh, I can't wait until the day where I never have to read this book again unless I want to, which will probably never happen because I love this book. I don't mean that I'll never read it again, but just that like I'll never probably be able to read it if I just want to. Because I'm planning to write sequels. I'm probably gonna have to look at it a lot, but I don't mind because I do love it. But I would say a fun highlight would be getting to design merch and also ordering like bookmarks and pens with my name on it to give out to people, and like business cards. I've been ordering so many new marketing materials and that kind of thing to just give out and give away. So I would say that's been really fun to like be like, my bookmarks are here, and then pull them out and like they have my book on them and the information and the pens with my name on them, and then also formatting the paperback has been really, really fun. More fun than I thought it would be. I think people always talk about formatting like formatting is so hard, but I mean it is. It's also kind of a pain. Don't get me started on ebook formatting. We'll get there, folks. Hopefully everything's fine now that the book is published when this video comes out, but I have enjoyed formatting the paperback and just seeing it all put together and getting my proof copies and getting my marketing materials and ordering pens with my name on them and getting bookmarks and all those kinds of things. So that's definitely been very fun, and putting together giveaways and a launch team and just talking to people about it. It's all been very fun. I joke about it like, and it is hard. There's a lot of work that goes into it. I joke about it like it's the hardest thing in my life, but it's also very rewarding as well.
What are you looking forward to once your book is published?
Not having to read it again. Not having to comb through it page by page and line by line to make sure every punctuation is perfectly placed. Just being able to look at it on a shelf and say, it's finished, it's done. And you know, reading it because I love it, and reading it to look things up and to enjoy it, but not having to read it for like having to get it ready, if that makes sense. And also just being able to talk about it with people and share it with people and hopefully see people's reactions if they're hopefully good. And just talk about it, you know? Not like read it for fun and talk about it for fun. Thank you so much, Audrey, for interviewing me. I'm so glad that we got to do this again together. Last time it was the other way around and I was interviewing you, so thank you so much for coming full circle with me. You are truly the greatest friend, and I hope that everyone out there watching enjoyed this collaboration as much as I did, because I couldn't imagine being interviewed by anyone else for my Interview with an Author series. Once again, thank you so much for watching. My name is Jenna Van Mourik, and if you liked today's video, make sure to hit the like button and maybe even leave a nice comment down below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon to make sure that all notifications are turned on. If you'd like to connect with me outside of YouTube, then you can do so on Instagram, where I am active pretty much every single day, and you can also check out my author website at www.authorjennavanmourik.com for more information about me, my books, and my free resources for you. All of my other social media links, handles, and information will be in the description box below. Thank you guys again so much for watching this video, and I will be back again as your regularly scheduled host next time.
It feels a little bit strange to say thank you for letting me interview you on your channel, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Thank you, Jenna. We are so excited for you and for this book. This has been a long journey full of many ups and downs, but it has led to a wonderful story. Your words have power, and we can't wait to see what powerful things God has in store.